Let me just predicate my remarks by saying, this is not a partisan issue. These are not partisan principles, or they shouldn't be anyways. If people want to make them partisan principles, that's on them. These are quintessential American principles that have made this country the envy of the rest of the world when it comes to competitiveness and economic growth. And today, what I want to talk about is, don't take anything I say from a partisan lens. What I want you to think through is up or down, not left or right, as Ronald Reagan would always say. And what is it going to take to turn Maryland around? Because clearly that's needed. I don't have to make this case in a strenuous way to anybody in this room. You all know the steps that are needed to try to start to turn this ship. It's not going to be a silver bullet situation. You're going to need to work on it for a long time. And I think that's why your engagement in groups like Maryland Free is so essential, that you are engaged, that you're working with your members, Republican, Democrat, Independent, across the board, and telling them what you feel about issues from a nonpartisan basis. Because if they don't hear from you, we know who they're hearing from, right? And I will finish with some positive news. I'm going to go through some ugly news for a little while this morning, but I promise I will finish it positive because of my home state's experience in Michigan, because I think there's some really interesting parallels from perhaps where you feel you are today, and a little hopeless in some cases with bad ideas and tax increases, certainly during the O'Malley years. Thankfully, Governor Hogan's come in and turned things around in a much different trajectory now, and thank God for that, because that would have been just horrible to have another 8 years like you had in the previous 8 years when it comes to the policy. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, or at least there can be, if you stay engaged and stay engaged with groups like Maryland Free. So this is how to follow me on social media. I'm pretty active on Twitter. If you're interested in these issues, I'm always kind of showing what's out around the states, as I'm usually in about 35 or 40 states a year talking with members about policy issues. And ALEC is a group that is a nonpartisan organization, like I mentioned, been around 45 years with our core governing principles of free markets, limited government, and federalism. We have about 2,000 state lawmakers who are members of ours across the board, and we also work with businesses across the board. We're not afraid to work with a public-private partnership as an organization. Sometimes the fake news media out there will demonize ALEC for being, oh, how dare you talk to businesses and talk to organizations that are employers. And to me, this is just a remarkable, strange attack on organizations, and you guys see it in Maryland all the time. Anybody that wants to stand up for those principles, they like to shoot the messenger, quite frankly. They don't want to talk about the issues, because they know when we talk about the issues and free enterprise perspective, we have the best answers. There's no doubt about it. And so that's what we're devoted to, and we encourage you all to stay involved. Let me talk a little bit about what's happening at the federal level, because I think it's been remarkable what's happened in the last couple of years in Washington, D.C. Who here, maybe previous to the election of President Trump, thought it was possible that we would see a complete rewrite of our federal tax code in the near future, right? Probably nobody. Because the last time we did a rewrite of the tax code, this was the scenario right here. And of course, that's not President Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton. That's President Ronald Reagan, and the year was 1986. That was the last time we remade our federal tax code. So it was 31 years in the making, and let's hope to God it's not another 31 years before we tackle it again, because what had happened, as you all know, is the U.S. had fallen behind the rest of the world by standing still, basically. We had our 35% corporate rate going into federal tax reform. We got it down to 21, and that was a huge difference. I think it's a game changer for so many American businesses as they try to compete with their competitors around the world. What happened, though, is, in 1986, our 35% business tax rate was about the world average. Fast forward to 2017, when we were debating the tax reform bill, the rest of the OECD country average, at least, was under 25. And so the U.S. had become very uncompetitive. And you saw these horrible stories about U.S.-based companies that were inverting for tax purposes and going to Ireland and going to England, and for God's sake, going to Sweden and France for lower taxes, right? I mean, this was a kind of a joke, you would think, but it was the fact that they could save that much, that they were tearing down operations and moving to Europe for lower taxes. That all changed with federal tax reform. And obviously, there's a lot of nuances to what happened, but overall, we've seen a remarkable effect. Obviously, this economy is still really strong right now. There's a few warning signs, I think, on the horizon, but No, I think we would, no doubt about it, be in economic downturn right now if it weren't for federal tax reform and regulatory relief and things that we've seen out of the federal level to help extend this bull market. I mean, a lot of people forget, we're going to talk about it in the context of public pensions later a little bit, but a lot of people forget this is the longest, at least equities run, that we've had in anyone's lifetime here. We just beat the tech boom in terms of its length, and it's remarkable that it's still going the way that it's going. And I do credit a lot of that to what's happened at the federal level. Now, one of the things that the media is not talking about, shockingly, I know to this group, is anything positive that happened from federal tax reform. You heard a lot of complaints and negative stories, and you heard about, there is the nuance of the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction that does hit higher income, higher taxed vicinities around the country, because that was capped at $10,000 annually instead of being unlimited previously. So there are some nuances to what happened, but one of the things that they really don't ever talk about is the effect that federal tax reform is now having at the state and local level. And you saw this play out in Annapolis this year. I know Delegate Krebs and I were in close contact, and I wish things would have turned out a whole lot better. You got some tax relief, but other states around the nation have seen so much more, and they've used the catalyst of federal tax reform to create their own tax reform back home. So I'll explain why in a second, but Iowa, Missouri, two of the largest tax reforms in state history in both of those states this last year following federal tax reform. Idaho, Georgia, same thing. Your neighbors down on the southern side of the Potomac in Virginia actually cut taxes in a massive way in 2019. We did an ALEC conference call where we had Delegate Krebs and then Delegate Tim Hugo from Fairfax County, one of the surviving Republicans in Northern Virginia, talk about his bill, and each taxpayer now in Virginia this fall will see a check mailed to them for the amount of something like $200 for a joint filer to give back the overage of basically what happened with federal tax reform. So let me backtrack just a second and get into the weeds here. I'm an economist, so occasionally we do get into the weeds. I promise you we'll pull you out of the weeds closely afterwards, but let me just explain the linkage of the federal tax code to the state tax code, because this is the phenomenon that's caused all of this. And by the way, Bernie Sanders' Vermont even cut taxes this year because of federal tax reform. So don't let you hear for a minute people like Andrew Cuomo and Bernie Sanders and others talking about how federal tax reform has been horrible for their states that's allowed them to cut taxes. And here's why. We saw the phenomenon in 1986 as well. When the federal tax base gets broadened, that is, deductions and credits are disallowed and taxable income is broader, what we did at the federal level as part of tax reform is to reduce rates, so 90% of taxpayers saw a net tax cut as part of the federal level. But what happens when the states pick up? What happens is all states with income taxes, the 41 states that have wage income taxes, start with either federal adjusted gross income or federal taxable income as their starting point. And both of those numbers were larger because of the actions at the federal level. So if states did nothing, they see a massive increase in revenue. Or you could say it another way, a massive tax increase that happens at the state level that was unintended by the federal policy. And so what we've seen now, the debate across state capitals this year has been whether states give that money back to taxpayers and avoid the tax increase at the state and local level, or they hoard it and hope that everyone's looking the other way and don't realize that there was an effective local and state tax increase in relation to the federal tax cuts. So I promise I'd get you out of the weeds. That's the real deep dive of why this effect has happened. But what it's meant for many states is, if not hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of unforeseen and unbudgeted and ongoing revenue, which in the case of legislators, how often does that happen to those extents? I mean, this is a once in a generation opportunity, I think, to make your states more competitive. Maryland swung and largely missed when it comes to providing this relief. Probably not a surprise to this audience, but other states have moved the ball forward, left and right states across the board. Now, the other trends nationally, which I think are playing into the revenue picture at the state level, is the Wayfair decision. Anybody follow that decision? I know this is a controversial issue. Personally, and I'll give you a long story after this breakfast if you really want me to go into the weeds on that one, because that is a weedy issue. I don't like how it turned out in the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's going to be bad for long term for interstate commerce and for complexity and for small businesses that are looking to sell across state lines, because now all of a sudden you have The case was basically related around internet sales taxes and for companies that didn't have physical presence in states, and now states are able to have them be their unpaid tax collectors, more or less. That's the oversimplified way of what happened there. By extension, that's been a big revenue source for states all now, because they're going across state borders and doing collections they couldn't do. Now, of course, the New Jersey case on PAPSA was the case that legalized sports betting. Before New Jersey and had the case, Nevada was really the only state that was heavily utilizing that right pre-federal law in 1992. So now we've seen several dozen states either enact or expand or at least introduce legislation. And Maryland was part of that, weren't they? Where did you guys end up on that this year? There was legislation filed, but it didn't go this year. And then finally, I mean, the issue of cannabis taxation. There's a lot of states that are now legalizing, and it's a weird issue because it's still illegal under federal law. Yeah, but states are going ahead and generally on the ballot initiatives are legalizing it and then figuring out the taxation element. Colorado, California, Washington State being some of the states that have taken the early gains on that. So those are some other elements that we're seeing broadly this year. One of the things before we get into Maryland competitiveness specifically is the nexus between state taxes and state spending, because take a step back for a second and think about it with the sense that at least states have to go through the exercise of trying to balance a budget. We don't even do that at the federal level in Washington, D.C. Now, you can complain about how your balanced budget amendment isn't effective, and a lot of state balanced budget amendments are not effective. Look at California, for instance. But you do have to go through the exercise. You don't have printing presses at the state level. You do have to go through this idea that spending is taxation at the state level. And the sooner everyone gets on that same page, whether you want bigger government or smaller government, I think we're all in a better spot. And that let's not pretend that when we're spending and overspending, that doesn't mean a future tax increase at some level. But what we're trying to do is kind of think through. Right now, I think it's a dangerous point for fiscal conservatives and those who believe in responsible size of government, because right now the times are so good because of all the things we've just talked through. Revenue streams are new, the economy's hot right now, and we've seen. I've been doing this long enough, and you all have been following this long enough to know this is a business cycle issue. The good times never last forever, even though people think they do. And right now is a dangerous point because states are spending too much. No doubt about it. I think in many cases we've seen double-digit spending growth in the last fiscal year across states, which is clearly not sustainable. And the question is not obviously if, but when the downturn happens, how are states going to start to prioritize, just like you would as a business owner or you would as a taxpayer with your family budget. And so what we're trying to get through is to break through the problem. And I think my favorite economist, or one of them, Thomas Sowell, put it best, which is the first law of economics is a scarcity of resources, right? But the first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is we have forgotten that basic point, and we're setting ourselves up for failure. And I tell you what, for those of us who believe in competitive business environments and keeping the cost of business down, this is very dangerous, because this crisis mode budgeting of what happens in states like Maryland and California and Illinois and New York is how we end up losing, is because they set us up for failure by overspending and then kind of building up these baseline budgets, knowing the crash is going to happen at some point. Maybe they don't think it's going to, but we know it's going to happen. And then when it does, oh, we've just built our baseline budgets up by 20 or 30% over the last few years. Now we have to raise taxes because we can't cut those budgets, right? Or if we do, we cut them by 1 or 2 points or something like that. So right now, that's kind of what keeps me up at night, is whenever this downturn does happen, and it will at some point. Let's hope we can get a couple of more years of extension on this recovery. But when it happens, how are we preparing for that? And if we don't prepare well, let's not be too surprised if we don't have good people in leadership positions in states that they do go down the road of tax increases again. So one of the models we have thought through over the years a lot is how do you do more priority-based budgeting for state government? And Washington State, as many of you heard me talk about before, did it on a bipartisan basis. And here are the 5 questions that got them started. And I'm happy to share the slides if anybody would like to see them, because I'm going to have to go through some fairly quickly today. But basic things like, how do we know what success looks like, basically, right? This is a question where if you're a business person, you don't stay in business very long if you don't know what success looks like and how to measure success. You know, for our legislators here, how many times does that really get asked in a very meaningful way and followed through with metrics and results and ex post facto audits and performance reviews and things like that at the state level? It doesn't happen very often. A few states do it to some degree, but not to the degree they should have. But fast forward to what happened in Washington State. They had a $2 billion budget deficit. They solved it without a dime of tax increases because they went through this exercise and said, if you put a cap and say our economy is too weak to raise taxes, you can do a whole lot when it comes to prioritization. If you don't have that, then if tax increases are always on the table, then you never go through this, quite frankly, because this is hard work. You know, people talk about, this is something that gets my craw up sometimes, is that people talk about, oh, it's so hard to raise taxes. No, that's the easy way out. This is the difficult way out, to go through reprioritizing government, looking at efficiencies, but it has a huge payoff in terms of keeping your cost of doing business as a state down and keeping tax costs down. When it comes to the principles of taxation, these are the things that, and this is something that Senator Bates and others have worked on at ALEC. Here's what we boil it down to. You can have probably 1,000 principles of taxation. Everyone views it a little differently, depending on how your particular outcome is in many cases, unfortunately. But when it comes to basic principles, simplicity and transparency, awfully straightforward. The third principle hangs a lot of people up, and that is the issue that government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers when it comes to the tax code in our view. Now, obviously, it's a principled view. Some people would call it an ivory tower view and a think tank type view. And we know how things work in the real world, that people have to try to get their lowest effective tax rates possible to stay in a particular location and many times. But is that the best long-term policy? And I think the clear answer is no. And we've seen this play out across states many, many times, and that many times, in my view at least, the states that have the biggest problems when it comes to overall tax burdens and high rates are the states that engage most in the favoritism and the special credits and the special carve-outs and the special deals to one company over another or one industry over another. You know, you've probably all seen the New York ads that they've run across the nation now for years, saying come into New York for lower taxes because we'll give you a special deal if you invest in one of our little carved out zones. I think they call them enterprise zones of sorts. I think empire zones is what they call them up in New York. And you know, the fast forward to the results from what happened in New York is they spent tens of millions of dollars on a national ad campaign, which first clue is, if you're spending tens of millions of dollars on a national ad campaign as a state, you're not in very good shape to start with. But secondly, you know, nobody bought that. Like, nobody thinks New York is a good place to do business. You know, I tell that out in places like Wyoming and Utah and other states that are really fiscally conservative and low tax, and they just laugh at me when they say New York's saying that it's a low cost of doing business in New York, and it's like they just don't buy it. But you look at the numbers of what New York came up with, and it was something like $55 or $60 million spent in the first year of this program on TV ads, and it created a grand total of under 100 jobs. Like, the entire program, and it was probably all ad makers and videographers. Sorry to our videographer in the back of the room. But that's basically, I think, the epitome of what not to do, is have to go out there and do all these things and jump through all these hoops to get some sort of a special deal versus just keeping taxes low for everybody and let the free market win. Let the best man or the best woman and the best products and ideas and services that you're providing be the one that is the beneficiary of the tax code. And then finally, predictability is key. People don't want to see the rules of the game change after they've made, of course, their investment decisions. That's why the states that do well in our book, Rich States, Poor States, that do well in How Money Walks, and some of the other books, like Utah, have some of the best predictable tax codes, and they know if a business is going to invest in Utah, that the people of Utah, the legislators of Utah, are not going to come in and do something retroactively or even years into the future, because you know the philosophy of a state like Utah. And then the most important principle, obviously, here is the competitiveness principle or the pro-growth principle, because you can get all the others right, but if your tax rates are too high, and even if your sticker rate's too high, and you have credits and deductions that get the effective rate down, it doesn't matter. A lot of people just don't consider you for the game if you're not in competition when it comes to the overall top rate. So one of the key factors, of course, of our research is Art Laffer. He's been working with us on this project, and wasn't that awesome to see him win the Presidential Award for Freedom the other day? That was just remarkable to see that. Unfortunately, I was traveling and I missed the ceremony. I was so bummed, but it was so great to see it all over the national news. But of course, he came up with this idea that really did change the world when it comes to public policy making and tax policy, and that is the Laffer curve. You've all heard it. You may have seen people sketch it out on a napkin like he did, as a legend would have it, with Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld one day at the Hotel Washington next to the U.S. Treasury Department. And, you know, it's gotten a lot of negative attention over the years because I think fundamentally some people just don't understand it or don't want to understand it. Similar to mailing books to folks that don't read it, maybe. You know, the issue is here, at a 0% tax rate, how much revenue do you raise for government? Easy. Now, here's where people get tripped up. At a 100% tax rate, how much revenue do you raise for government? Zero, because nobody works for the privilege of paying taxes, right? Nobody. Now, the people have called this voodoo economics and other things, and you know, Paul Krugman at the New York Times, who was a formerly very respected economist, he actually won, a lot of people don't know this, he won his Nobel Peace Prize in economics for free trade back in, what, the 90s, I guess it was. And now, since he's become more of a partisan columnist at the New York Times and a left-wing columnist at that, he's gone after Laffer pretty hard. And a lot of people misrepresent this to say that by cutting taxes you always raise more revenue. That's not what the Laffer curve shows. The Laffer curve shows the relationship that there's a behavioral effect when people change the incentives, whether it's tax rates or regulation or other hurdles. You're going to get less economic activity and, by extension, in some cases at least, less tax revenue than you would have otherwise because of this change of incentive effect. Because when you get to this level, Ronald Reagan talked about it when he was an actor back in the days before the Kennedy JFK Democrat tax cuts of the 60s, we had a top rate of federal income tax on the personal side of in the 90% range. That when he got to that range, he would stop making movies because at that point it wasn't worth it to him. That was a simple example, but you can imagine the business incentive effect when you get to those type of marginal rates. People engage in less business and more leisure. Maybe they spend more time with their kids or their grandkids. And you can see how that would have a measurable effect on not only economic growth, but then by extension tax growth. So one of the key findings of our book always is, this is going along the lines of how money walks. We talk about it in ways of how people vote with their feet, in a way of walking from one state to another when it comes to this race across these 50 laboratories of democracy that we have across the 50 states. And here's just the top 5 and the bottom 5. And this is a 10-year window. This isn't just 1 year. This is, you know, we're not cherry picking any data here. This is a long-term trend in many of these states, that the states on the left side of the column here are generally states with free enterprise and limited government and pro-liberty policy ideas. Texas and Florida being the largest two gainers, with Texas gaining more than 1.3 million Americans on net over the last 10 years. Now let me tell you what this is and what this isn't. It is net domestic migration, which is important because those numbers would be even larger in some of these in-migration states if it was total population. What this doesn't consider birth rates or death rates, it doesn't consider international immigration. What it considers is when Americans are in the United States, where are they going once they're in the United States? So it tells us from a public policy perspective a little bit more instructively maybe some of the policy levers that states are using that are attractive to new migration from states that are maybe less attractive. So Florida and Texas, the big ones. North Carolina, a state that I know Maryland has lost a ton of businesses and individuals to over the years, a state that just did huge tax reform about 5 years ago and became very competitive, a flat tax of about 5% on personal. Anybody know what the North Carolina corporate income tax is? 2.5%. That was part of the massive tax reform that they did several years ago, one of the best in the last couple of decades. And of course, you see the continued positive results there from North Carolina. Colorado, a state that has gotten a lot of attention from California, ex-residents and ex-businesses have gone to Colorado. Arizona, the same thing. And then when you look at the states without migration, maybe ask yourself the question, what do these states have in common, right? And that is New York, down 1.3 million. The idea that you can run TV ads to make up for bad policy just doesn't work. Illinois follows behind at nearly 800,000 down. And that is really a sad story of the state of Illinois. I think they're going to even get worse before it gets better in Illinois. They just passed a $15 an hour minimum wage. Might sound familiar here after what happened this year in Annapolis, but they're also putting a progressive income tax on the ballot for 2020. One of the only really saving graces for Illinois policy recently has been that they've had a flat tax of under 5% on personal income taxes. That will likely go away, in my opinion, after 2020 of what's on the ballot. So look out for probably even worse things happening there. California, no need to really repeat that story, although I will say in the media, they've tried to put a really good marketing campaign together to say that California is actually doing well. We'll get into a few more of those details later, but clearly people do not leave states to this degree if things are doing well. The proof is in the pudding. You can talk about short-term trends on GDP or other things, or even revenue for the state, because they had some big tax increases, but people don't leave states like that if the economy has economic opportunity. That's one of the key lessons from rich states, poor states. And then New Jersey and Michigan, unfortunately my home state. Now, I see my slide was doctored here by someone that might have the name Dwayne. So this was supposed to be the big house here in Ann Arbor, and largest stadium in sports in the U.S., of course. Now our football team need a little improvement to keep up with our stadium in terms of the top stadium in the country. But if you were to fast forward to Ann Arbor, this is 113,000 people roughly seat in the stadium at the big house. And when we talk about these numbers right here, people's eyes kind of glaze over occasionally. They all look like big numbers. But when you think about it, over a 10-year period, New York has lost 13 of these stadiums full of taxpayers to other states. And now they complain that they have a budget shortfall in New York, right? And they want to blame this on the Trump tax reform package and Governor Cuomo sued against the federal government because they thought they were being discriminatory against high-tax states. Guess what? No, they got bigger problems. They had 1.3 million people decide to go to another state. And that's really the crux of it. Now, from a political perspective, it means a lot for political power. New York, over the last 50 years or so, has lost 14 congressional districts on net because of the loss of population. That has a huge political consequence on New York's political influence. Now, some people may like the fact that there's not more AOCs roaming the halls of Congress by them being down 14 members, but you really do look at what the effect has been. Pennsylvania down 9 members of the U.S. House delegation. Ohio down 8, sorry. I mean, Michigan's only down 3. Ohio's really losing population as well. And then 2020. This is really interesting too. There's some fun stories here. This is out of current projections, the states that we think will lose and gain different congressional seats based on reapportionment after the 2020 census. And as you know, most congressional districts hover around 700,000 Americans to the district. And so we think some of the big winners will be states like Florida and Texas. Florida's going to gain 2 seats. Texas will gain 3 new congressional seats after 2020. And then the losers, New York's going to lose 2 congressional districts additional to what they just have lost over the last 50 years. Now, I put an asterisk on some of these because we don't know if it'll be -1, -2 in some cases, or 0 or -1. But California stands out as a story that is worth repeating, and that is California, since statehood roughly in 1850, always gained congressional seats every 10 years. Fast forward to 2010, California did not gain a congressional seat for the very first time in state history because of the impact of outmigration that we talked about. Even with international immigration coming in, even with birth rates over death rates, they have now gotten to a point where they lost the ability to gain a seat. Go to 2020, it looks like California is on the very verge of actually losing a congressional district because of the outmigration. So don't let the mainstream media headlines fool you. California is not doing well overall, and the population losses are a good signaling factor as to why. The other kind of broad key finding from rich states, poor states is not all taxes are created equally. Some taxes matter more than others when it comes to economic growth. And it turns out, based on our research, but not just our research, OECD that follows this internationally and other groups have found that taxes on capital, whether that's business income taxes, personal income taxes. Since on the personal income tax side, so many small businesses file on that side, it's really a very capital intensive tax. But capital gains and dividends and any other capital based tax are the most damaging in terms of economic growth. That is pretty clear based on the research across the board. So one of the things every year we do is look at the 9 states in America that do not have a personal income tax whatsoever on wage income, and compare them with states, unfortunately, like Maryland, who falls into the category now of being one of the states with the 9 highest income taxes. And this is combined state and local. So we take the average combined, which is obviously very high in many of the counties and cities here in Maryland. And we look at GDP growth, population growth, receipt growth of tax receipts, and job growth, all kind of the key metrics of economic health. And across the board, the states without personal income taxes vastly outperform the states with high income taxes. Now you might just say, well, Williams, this might be a small phenomenon, or you might be cherry picking the data. This is 10 years of data here, but I will say Art Laffer has 50 years of data going back previous to this experiment. And every 10-year period over the last 50 years that he has demonstrated, states without a personal income tax have outperformed states with high income taxes. Now you can get into the weeds of correlation is not causation. There's some great causal evidence and academic work to show this, but I don't need to tell you this. You're business owners and you know exactly how much income taxes matter to decisions, whether it's expansion decisions, location decisions, so many other things, and hiring decisions. And then let me say, maybe to those that don't care as much about economic growth, that want the tax code maybe to be used for other purposes like redistribution, this ought to be a wake-up call, because the most volatile sources of revenue are capital-based sources of revenue. So business income taxes, that's the real jagged line here, is the corporate income tax. The boom and the bust cycle that we talked about, that's so important, I think, to avoid. That, by the way, even outgoing Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, before he left office, has said, we have become so dependent on capital-based taxes and progressive taxes that this boom and bust cycle has got to end in California. This would be a really big point, I think, is a bipartisan point that everyone should be concerned about. As you rely too much on income taxes, you get a volatile revenue stream, and it really creates problems for appropriators and budgeters and good budgeting practices. So to our rankings of the states, this is the 2019 Rich States, Poor States ranking. We rank on 15 different criteria on taxes and regulation, labor policy across the board. And now we've done this is our 12th edition of the rankings. This is the most recent edition of the hard copy, so we release it in 2 parts every year. Around tax day every year, we release the new rankings, so you can talk about it at tax day and your town halls and things like that. But then right now in the process of writing the chapters that create the full edition of the book. And so the top 10 states this year, probably not a big shocker that Maryland doesn't crack the top 10 this year of this group. But Utah is number 1, and they've been at number 1 now for 12 years in a row. I was just out there in Salt Lake a couple of weeks ago giving a talk, and I will say it's really nice to go to places where you rank them number 1 all the time. They really like you for some reason. I don't know why that is. I don't get the same reaction in New York. But Utah has a couple of keys. Let me just talk briefly about, I think they've stayed at number 1 for all these 12 years and things that they've done right. Overall, I talked a little bit about their prudence in balancing budgets and taxes earlier, but a couple of the other factors. They have been, one thing that's been really important is, anybody complain about property taxes here, right? A little high probably. You've complained about them. Legislators hear about those complaints a lot probably. One of the things that Utah did, I think, is phenomenal, and we're going to be considering it as ALEC model policy this summer at our meeting, is they put together, they call it a truth in taxation law that they passed in the 1980s. Because in my view, one of the biggest problems with property taxes is the assessment-driven property tax problem, which no recorded votes in many cases are ever taken. People will tell you at local level that property tax levies have been cut, but you realize your bill is higher than it was the year before. What in the heck happened? It's because of the assessment-driven process in many cases that's out of control, and many, especially the cities and counties that are a little greedy with your tax dollars, is that's a hidden way to raise your taxes without anybody having to take political accountability. So what they did in Utah was said, well, we're not going to limit you at the local level of raising property taxes, but if you do, you need to have a public hearing, a public vote, and get public input and go on a recorded vote to say, here's who raised your taxes on assessment or rate. And that's been very effective to keeping property taxes in check, even as the population's boomed in Utah. Another thing is they have done what every state probably needs to do eventually, and some states have already gotten there, is tackle the massive issue of unfunded pension obligations. This is an issue that it threatens the future of every single state. I think it's maybe not even an over-exaggeration at all to say that this is the existential financial problem facing states and state budgets, and by the way, by extension, taxes. If you ever want to get taxes down in Maryland, somehow there's got to be addressing the issue and starting to solve the issue of these massive unfunded pension obligations. And Utah did. They transitioned to more of a defined contribution style plan that everybody in the private sector went to, because guess what? Private sector companies actually follow real accounting rules when it comes to their pensions. They follow their under ERISA laws if they have defined benefit plans remaining. And that people go to jail when you don't do the right thing in defined benefit pensions. And we had a long history as a nation to learn that people needed to be held accountable in some cases because games were being played with people's pensions. Guess what? The public sector doesn't follow those rules. And if you were in the public sector, and the kind of accounting that I know Delegate Krebs and Senator Bates and Delegate Kittleman have to deal with, is if you're a CEO or a CFO and you're signing off on financials that are being used to govern public pensions at the state and local level, you would be in jail by signing off on those statements because of the bad assumptions that are being used, by the annual required contributions that are not really required at the state and local level or not being made. This is a huge crisis that's building and building, and the numbers for Maryland are much higher than the official state reports would suggest. In fact, the other publication I brought is all about public pensions, and we rank the states by unfunded liability because that's really a future tax increase. The number for Maryland, are you ready for this? I'm glad you're all sitting. $15,000 for every man, woman, and child in the state would be what it would need to pay off the current unfunded liabilities, assuming that more bad decisions aren't made in the future when it comes to public pensions. So it's a massive issue that needs to be dealt with. And so that's some of the keys to Utah. Here are the other states that round out the top 10. Indiana's one that's been incrementally creeping up now for about 6 or 7 years, starting with Governor Mitch Daniels, Governor Mike Pence. They became a right-to-work state, as many of you know, started the Midwestern movement towards right to work. And they also have been cutting personal and corporate income taxes, capping property, and also sales taxes. Then you have the no income tax states of Tennessee and Florida. We talked about North Carolina and their massive tax reform of 2.5% corporate rate. And so many good things happening in the top 10. Bottom 10, luckily Maryland doesn't quite crack its way into the bottom 10, although you're getting awfully close. It's getting tenuous. New York's been 50th out of 50 for nearly every edition of Rich States, Poor States. Bernie Sanders, Vermont, even though they cut taxes, still have a ways to go at number 49. Illinois, California, New Jersey round out the bottom 5. So Maryland's at 34 right now. Obviously, that's not as maybe not as good as you'd like to see it. Maybe it's not as bad as you'd like to see it, depending on your perspective. But here are a few of the reasons why. And I will say there should be somewhat of a caveat. Anytime we talk about Maryland, you talk about census figures, is when you look at tax burdens. Maryland's tax burden looks artificially low because of the income levels being artificially high with the federal government presence, obviously. So that's one thing that you probably do rank worse than 34, but government statistics won't really show that. Low sales tax burden is one of the things. You don't have a low sales tax rate, but because of your income levels being high, census determines that based on personal income as a percentage, so you look relatively good there. Also relatively low workers' comp costs to other states, which may be a surprise. I don't know the story behind that. I'll have to get filled in on that from some of the people that have followed it. Yeah, comment?
The reason why it's low is because we actually have a very low industrial base. So we have,
well, there you go.
Production is second lowest to, I think, Hawaii, which is the goods and services according to.
Because you've taxed everything out of the state, and then it's
so there's not a lot of workers' comp issues.
Right.
Really doing a lot of jobs.
So that's almost fake news then. We can, okay, good.
Is workers' comp laws in Maryland are caustic compared to Virginia and Wisconsin. If you look at the how, when you can initiate workers' comp, like I think it's like 3 or 5 days compared to like 10 days. There's all sorts of other, and we have in perpetuity issues. We also have, well, anyways, I don't want to go into it. There's a lot of issues.
Well, yeah, let's follow up about that because that's really important layer of texture to that data point. Yep.
And an improved regulatory environment that has created competition with additional carriers in the state.
All right, very good. Thank you, Governor Hogan, and his work. So, and then, of course, many of the things, I almost ran out of sides of this slide to fit in some of the problems there that cause you to get your weighting weighed down. Income tax rates, the local add-on, both on personal and then corporate rates being over the average as well. Remaining tax burden, that's everything outside of income, property, and sales. So the fees and other taxes that all kind of get aggregated in that category, you come in the bottom 10 nationally in a bad way. And then certainly being the only state in America now to have the estate and inheritance tax, something that Delegate Krebs has talked about for many years and I've worked with her on. Even New Jersey repealed, that was the other state that had both, even they repealed one of the two, and I forget which one it was, under Governor Christie as one of his deals before he left office. So you do stand alone as one state out of the 50 that have both an estate and inheritance tax. And by the way, that's a big deal for a lot of people when they look towards retirement. There's a reason Florida's awfully attractive, and it's not just the beaches. It's no personal income tax, no death tax, and the Carolinas the same way. In fact, we've seen tons of states over the last decade repeal their state-level death taxes because they realize it may not have even raised much revenue at all when you consider the out-migration effect. I mean, you had this situation in New Jersey where, anybody see this in the news, David Tepper, one of the richest people in New Jersey, a hedge fund billionaire, left the state of New Jersey, moved to Florida. And New Jersey legislators had to come in and during an interim session realize they had like a $20 million budget shortfall because one individual decided to pick up and leave, and he left because of obviously better conditions. Then right to work is a big deal. It's a yes or no variable, really, when it comes to our report. And the Midwest has moved dramatically in that direction because of the Indiana effect. Once that domino fell in Indiana, you remember the political circumstances where they didn't get it done in the first year when Mitch Daniels was governor. You remember the Democrats fled the state of Illinois, went and denied them quorum, so they couldn't even vote on right to work. They came back the next year, I think, because of the deal they crafted to get them back. Voted on it, it passed. Fast forward to what's happened across the Midwest, states like my home state of Michigan, Wisconsin, birthplace of UAW, birthplace of progressive movement, becoming right to work states, I think is really remarkable. I think that's been a game changer for the Midwest, and we've seen the results afterwards.
The top in Maryland, because that's what drives our budget.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's right. And here's the overall, I didn't have a chance to go into as much detail as like today, but you can go to richstatespoorstates.org, which has the 12th edition rankings all preloaded, and you can go and click on each state to see how that state ranks, and also historically where you've been for all 12 editions of Rich States, Poor States. And the other thing that we allow you to do, which is kind of fun, is you can go into a particular state page, and then you can hit this red button and adjust policies, and you can say, what if we became a right to work state? What if we cut taxes to 5% like North Carolina? What if we had a 2.5% corporate rate like North Carolina? What would that do to the overall ranking? And as you can see with the click of a button, how that would change Maryland's ranking. So it's a fun thing for lawmakers as they're considering, policies, or you to see how could we turn Maryland around and get back to at least the top half of states. And so I encourage you to pick up the unfunded pension liability report. I had some pension slides to go in more detail. I think that'll be a presentation for another day because we're running short on time. But let me just leave you with this, is don't take my word for any of this as free market economist Jonathan Williams. I want you to take the word of a negative example and a positive example to close. The negative example is a state of Connecticut. Many of you know that state, back up until 1991, I guess it was, didn't even have a personal income tax. They would have fallen into that category of the states we talked about earlier. They created a personal income tax because of a budget crisis. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's exactly, they've grown it up over time, become a very high tax state. And outgoing two-term Democrat Governor Daniel Malloy, and by the way, during his tenure, they lost a little family business by the name of General Electric, who left Connecticut and went, do you know who they went to?
Boston.
Massachusetts, right? And if you're losing, there's a joke there somewhere, if you're losing companies to go to Massachusetts for lower taxes, you've got real problems as a state. But here's the takeaway from Governor Daniel Malloy, who is the head of the DGA, pretty liberal Democrat. He said, I've raised taxes multiple times and it's not working. Spurring economic growth is what's necessary. Don't take my word for it. Take the liberal Democrat governor of Connecticut, who learned the lesson the hard way of what's happened there. And then my home state, of Michigan. That's the optimistic note, where I think there are some parallels to Maryland. That, we were a single state recession, double-digit unemployment for a decade. When I graduated from business school, there were hardly any private sector jobs available. We were losing our kids and our grandkids to other states for pure economic opportunity. We were spending a ton on K-12 education. We have great institutions of higher education like University of Michigan, and we were losing them, though. We were spending all that money, and then we were educating, in essence, the workforce of Texas and the workforce of Florida and the workforce of states that actually got it right when it comes to competitiveness. But Michigan turned it around. We realized that we needed a different sense of outlook and business environment. We became a right-to-work state, which, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't think in my lifetime I would see my home state of Michigan, the birthplace of the UAW, a right-to-work state. And also, they repealed onerous prevailing wage laws when it comes to school construction and other things like that drove up tremendously the cost of building new schools and renovating. And then we cut taxes. We actually had one of a horrible corporate tax regime called the Michigan Business Tax, which was a kind of a very strange corporate income tax, gross receipts tax hybrid that for businesses that were dealing in multiple states, it was one of a kind that created huge compliance costs in addition to the tax burden. We repealed that and went to a flat 6% corporate income tax, in addition to making other tax reductions to make Michigan more competitive. So let me just say, before we get to any questions if we have time, if we can turn it around in Michigan, you can turn it around anywhere, including Maryland. So that's the optimistic note I promised I would end with. Thank you very much to Dwayne, to Maryland Free for being back. Thanks very much. Great. Questions? Yeah.
I'd be curious, I see some anomalies, right? I looked at New Hampshire, which seems to recently been rated one of the worst states in terms of economic growth, compared to Vermont, which seems to be doing pretty well. Do you have any rational reason as to why, we saw Arkansas was in there. I didn't, any thoughts as to...
With the, are you talking about the new CNBC rankings that came out this week? So there's a lot of different ways to rank states. I mean, there's a ton of, in a way, there's almost a proliferation of indices that you see these days. And I think the getting down to the basics of what they're measuring is always really important. Our ranking is only 15 factors. We could be measuring probably 1,000, like I mentioned. But I think the things that are important that we look at are, we know that all of our variables matter for economic growth based on the academic evidence, the business evidence, experiential. But then secondly, I think is just as important, if not more important, and this is where some of the other rankings and indices fail, is they're not things that state lawmakers actually can control in many cases, where our rankings are. We know that each and every one of our policy levers to move your score in rich states, poor states, are things that Delegate Kittleman and Delegate Krebs can control down in Annapolis, or hope to control if you have the right friends around you. But that's the thing, is some of the other rankings will look at nebulous factors like quality of life or things like that, and it's like, well, that would be great if we could just legislate quality of life, but that doesn't happen, right? And so the other thing I would point to that you see some outliers is, depending on the time frame that people are looking at, sometimes states do catch-up growth where they had a decade of lost growth. All of a sudden, for a short period of time, they catch up and they look like they're leading the country in economic growth. And it depends on the window. And then also it depends on their competitor states too. Oregon does very well in terms of economic growth in some measures. And the more I looked into this, Oregon has very bad policies. In fact, if you followed what happened in Oregon this year, they just created a business gross receipts tax. They doubled their gas tax. They did a lot of things that were very anti-business, and they almost passed a statewide cap and trade bill that was worse than California's. Republicans left the state, if you follow that whole drama that happened nationally. But one of the reasons why Oregon, in my view, has stayed afloat is catching up from past lost growth, but then also they're less bad than California, and they're in the region. And a lot of people that want to retire for low retirement costs, no sales tax in Oregon, they will leave California, go to a high tax state like Oregon, but realize that they're still saving money. And so sometimes that's another factor for some of these anomalies. Yep.
Just out of curiosity, all of these people who are leaving the bad states and going to the good states, do they take their voting preferences with them, and are they going to turn the good states back?
Well, and so let me just preface this with, this is not a political answer, and that's a good question for political scientists. As the economist, I mean, I think from a engagement perspective, and you know, I think Dwayne would back me up on this, I know he would, is that this is why it's so important for lawmakers such as yourselves and for groups such as Dwayne's and this organization to help people connect the dots, not from a political perspective, but from a policy perspective, to say, why is it that you didn't have economic opportunity or a job or a good paying job and you were underemployed or unemployed in a state like New York or my home state that happened for so long in Michigan or California, but you went to Texas or you went to North Carolina and you went to Florida for economic opportunity. A lot of people are so busy, and they rightly so, raising their families and doing things, taking their kids to soccer practice and doing all the real life items that they don't follow this kind of stuff on a day-to-day basis like you do and like we do. So it's somewhat incumbent, I think, on, I hate to turn this around on you, Delegate, but it's incumbent on you and it's incumbent on Dwayne and your group and groups like yours all around the country to talk about the policy differences of states and help people realize why. And employers as well. I think it's awfully important for employers to say, we're expanding in Utah, we're expanding in Texas, and we're moving our operations. We're not expanding in Silicon Valley, and we're going to the Slope in Salt Lake City, or we're going to Austin and expanding our presence there. Why is that? Help people understand, because I don't think intuitively people get the policy rationale.
One of the, I always find is, I've been doing this in Maryland for a long time, lobbying in Annapolis, and, Maryland is kind of a sectional kind of mentality. Over in the Montgomery County area, they have their own perception of what's good. And they feel they have it really good. So when you talk to them about the need for all of these things, it doesn't really register, because they don't have manufacturing, they don't want manufacturing, they don't see the need for it. They've got full employment. They don't look on Baltimore as being their problem. They see it as a problem, but not something that they need to worry about, except that it brings revenue. And it doesn't really factor into their idea of how Maryland needs to improve. In Baltimore City, when you talk to Baltimore City, the delegation there about, gee, we need to get our act together here, right to work would make, a real improvement in attracting manufacturing and such into Baltimore. Mm-hmm. They seem to think, look at you like you've got two heads, like, the unions would never go with that, and they apparently, sold out to that group, and it's a non-starter. So, we can't ever seem to get them to focus on the idea that we could improve the economy for the people who need it most, which is the people in Baltimore who are sitting there with nothing to do or not enough to do, empty plants that could be revitalized and better jobs that could be lost. Tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs, and plants are sitting idle. A port that is underutilized, and a transportation system for distribution that's not properly developed. And we don't seem to be able to get our General Assembly focused on that, because it just doesn't seem to be anything that they're really concerned about. They just never really get off the story, because they feel like they've got it great. They're over in Montgomery County, they've got all the government jobs they want. You go over, and the same thing's true for Prince George's County. Mm-hmm. So that seems to be a real problem, and I think that what we've talked about here is absolutely on target, but I think we need to drill down a little bit deeper and find a nerve somewhere that we have found.
Yeah, no, do you want to weigh in on that first? Yeah.
I want to just elaborate for a second. We know that we don't have the problems that Detroit had, which led to Michigan going right to work. Mm-hmm. Right? We're not going to get there because it's good enough everywhere else. But we have horrendous situations in Western Maryland, the Eastern Shore, and Baltimore City. Mm-hmm. Those three areas desperately need manufacturing, warehouse, the more blue collar tech type jobs. And I think it was Kentucky that went county by county?
Yes, first,
to work?
before state, then they ended up doing it at the state level.
Were you guys involved in that? And
Mm-hmm.
are you talking at all with the Maryland legislators about how we might be able to, because I think we could maybe move a needle.
And getting county right to
little
work.
pockets, but I know
Yeah.
that the politicians are worried that it's a
Let me just say,
nose under the tent.
one of the concepts that Patty Van Basu and I talked about was enabling legislation to allow municipalities to become right to work, possibly only relative to the private sector. Could be analogous
It would have to be private sector.
enterprise zone.
That's right.
I had a conversation with Mike Bush about 3 years ago. He agreed in private that made all kinds of sense, but he could never say it publicly.
Right.
I think there's a lot of
So then it's incumbent on us to educate
There's a lot of
everybody.
sentiment of that, but
Right.
it's the camel's nose under the tent. That's what the
what they're
concern
afraid of,
of the
yeah.
unions. And unions are so powerful. They're the biggest political force in Maryland by far.
Yeah, and you know, it's a difficult, you know, because it's got to be, in a way, different conversations with different parts of delegations, right? Because I think the case to be made in a Baltimore situation is somewhat analogous to Detroit in some respects, different political circumstances, but certainly the devastation of loss of population, loss of manufacturing, loss of good-paying jobs in the area is pretty spot on to deal. And you know, in Michigan, they realized statewide that to be healthy as a state, you needed a Detroit that was going to start to turn things around. And thank goodness for private sector entrepreneurs like Dan Gilbert and others in the city of Detroit that have helped to make that happen. Of course, the bankruptcy was painful, but you know, they have emerged from that, and it's a lot of people are seeing it as a pretty good investment opportunity in some cases. Now, you go to the Montgomery County discussion is, I think, trickier actually than the Baltimore discussion because things are so good. And there's no doubt about it that the federal government being, you know, in at least from an economic sense in Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland has been a huge positive when it comes to economic activity that otherwise maybe wouldn't have happened, and people get very comfortable with that and say nothing needs to change. The same thing in Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia. They don't see the problems in Richmond and some of the other places.
You can reduce the traffic jams.
Right, I would get drawn and quartered in some places for saying that was a net positive. But I mean, from an purely economics perspective, the economic activity suggests that it clearly is. But you know, with things so good, with near frictional unemployment being like zero there, I mean, that's an issue where people don't see the need to change, right? So I do think the local approach is a good one to talk about from a policy perspective, and that's where Kentucky started, as you noted, before they became a statewide right to work state with Governor Bevin. They started county by county, and I was talking with some folks in Delaware that were trying that strategy with Sussex County there, and then the Delaware General Assembly came in and preempted local right to work in Delaware and disallowed that option. I guess that's something that the states some of the left-wing states have kicked around. In New Mexico, they just did that too. That was a strategy to go after some of the pro-business counties in New Mexico, in the oil patch in the Permian Basin, and some of those areas. They came into Santa Fe this session and say, we're going to disallow it, and by the way, retroactively ban any previous right to work that was done at the local level. So we've got a clear battle that's going on the issue, and I think that those that are anti-right to work do realize that this is an existential threat, because once you see some small successes, even if they're small counties,
You see it work.
and you see some companies moving in, it's really hard to argue with that.
Well, I mean, I think that this is a great conversation here, and your suggestions are very good. But to do this, we can't work just at the state level. We really need to find a leader at the local level in Baltimore City. And the legislators at the local level are the ones that we need to focus on, probably city level too.
Yep. No, don't disagree at all.
Let's go ahead and wrap up. I know everybody's got other meetings to get to, and we can stick around and chat afterwards. Just make sure you all grab Rich States, Poor States. It's a quick read, but a very good read. And then also the pension reform booklet. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Great, thank you. All right. Absolutely.